You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
And I want to welcome Dan, who is the Communications Director with Heritage Action for America. Dan, it's always great to have you on the program, and welcome back to the Final Say Radio Show.
Hey, thanks a lot. How are you?
We're doing well. I hope you had a nice break and some holidays, and I hope you got a little bit of time off of work.
Yeah, just a little bit. You know, everybody likes to take days off in Washington, but if you just look around, the left never seems to take time off for some reason or the other, so it's a constant battle.
Yeah, well, maybe they don't believe in these particular holidays. Who knows? But Dan, the reason I'm happy that you're able to join us is when we heard the press conference by the president last week, and I heard some of his comments about what he's calling the success of Obamacare, I stand to differ. I think that you do as well. And I have to ask you off the bat, some of the numbers that they put out there, let's get to the bottom of these. Let's start with this one. 8 million people signed up. Okay, maybe 8 million people did. But how many people, because of the decisions of Obamacare, lost their policies to begin with, or were thrown, or companies just disbanded their policies?
Right. I mean, this is one of the questions that we're trying to figure out. And there's a bunch of studies out there. I think RAND has probably the most prominently cited one. It talks about the number of people who actually got health care coverage that didn't have it is a really small number. You're talking, maybe 1-2 million people. And the other thing that we don't know yet is how many of these folks have actually paid. There was a press report out, I think maybe over the weekend or this morning, that it was talking about Georgia, and about half the people who enrolled through in Georgia on the exchange have not paid. So, I mean, these are people who are going around and clicking these plans and realize, oh, this is actually kind of expensive. I'm not going to go through and follow through with this because, it still costs a whole lot of money. And, there's a lot of unanswered questions. And the really amazing thing is that the press has allowed them to, by them I mean the Obama administration, to move the goalposts. So it's no longer about providing affordable coverage for people. It's just about the number of sign-ups. So the press has been complicit in moving the goalposts, which shouldn't be a surprise to any of us.
No, and again, President's words. He says 35% of the people who enrolled through the federal marketplace are under age of 35. Now, they kept telling us that we need people in a younger age than 35 to sign up. So why are they using 35 now and not, in the 20s? Because we know, people who are coming out of college and they're wondering, hey, where's that job? That's the first thing they ask. But now I'm forced to go get health care that I don't even need?
Right. I mean, there's a lot of questions going on about what the numbers actually are, and what they've sort of fell victim to is their own rhetoric. And anytime you go back and line up, what their claims were, what they expected, what they needed to be successful, you realize basically all of that fell flat. Maybe with the exception of their, hey, we'll enroll 7 million, and it turned out to be 8. But again, those numbers are incredibly suspect. So, they don't want to be straight with the numbers because, it makes for a good story to have this conversation about the numbers. And one of the reasons it's a good story is people can understand it, right? It's a whole lot harder to understand, the personal decisions that everybody's facing thanks to the law.
Absolutely. Dan, are you sitting down?
I am.
Ready? Okay, good, because you have to for this one. See, the president says, we've also seen signs that the Affordable Care Act is bringing economic security to more Americans, because this law added new transparency and competition to the individual market.
It really is amazing, isn't it? I mean, these guys get away with saying pretty much whatever they want, and there's very little accountability to the impact. And you think about what folks have gone to, how they've had their plans canceled, the incredible cost that some of these people are facing to get in plans that have massive deductibles that they didn't have before. And you realize, what? There's a lot of problems with this, and what nobody's talking about is what are these insurance premiums and what are these rates going to look like for 2015? And most people have forgotten about it by now, but the administration pushed back the deadline for insurance companies to submit their new rates until after the midterm elections. I mean, there's no surprise why. These rates are going to come in, extremely high next time around, and they don't want to have those numbers out like they did this year ahead of that date.
Yeah, well, it's incredible because then he follows this up by saying that we regularly saw double-digit increases in premiums, which was true, and he says that's the norm. And while we suspect that the premiums will keep rising, there's the apology for what's really going on now, as they have for decades, because he's got to make it seem like this is an old problem, that since this law took in place, they've risen more slowly than at any time in the past 50 years, which is absolutely not true. And I'm going to say this, Dan. The policy started skyrocketing over the last few years when he started pushing Obamacare in the first place, and the insurance companies tried to get in every last dime they could, knowing that they're going to be hammered on the back end of this deal because there's no way they could make money when you're forced to offer things and then told you may not get paid for them. And let me give an example. When the president comes out there and says, well, our launch isn't working out so well, so just give people what they need and tell them they're covered, and we'll figure it out later. How does a company supposed to manage their bottom line like that?
Well, I mean, what he's asking private companies, I mean, it's arguable now how sort of, much these insurance companies are in the private sector at this point, but I mean, they're basically asking them to act like the federal government, which doesn't have to pay attention to a bottom line because they can borrow and print and do all this stuff. And maybe there's an argument to be said for insurance companies have that sort of protection given this risk corridor stuff that we heard so much about earlier this year. They were all over at the White House last week talking with the president. None of the healthcare executives would say what they talked about, but you got to think there's more of these assurances that, hey, you guys are going to be okay. Just keep on keeping on, and we'll make sure we get through this together, which isn't a very comforting thought.
Yeah, look, it's almost 5 years now that we're fighting this battle, and then he comes out and his bottom line is, hey, look, the Republicans have had over 50 votes or so trying to repeal this law, and this is a done deal. Get over it. Time to move on. It's working. You have nothing to complain about here. Well, I think you're wrong. I think if you look at any poll, the American people will tell you you're wrong, Mr. President. And I think if you actually stopped with the waiver game and every person in this country actually had to be subjected to this law from the beginning, I think it would have been thrown out by now and replaced with some of the ideas that the Republicans and others have come up with. What do you think, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to get to that point. Once more and more folks are impacted by this and they start to see the implications, it's going to come to this point where there's going to be an outcry to do something different. And I think we're there. Certainly the political dynamics in Washington don't allow it, with Harry Reid controlling the Senate and Obama still in the White House. But the whole entire notion that this is now settled and it's here to stay, that's not true. And it takes a lot of audacity for the president to make that claim, right? I mean, that's not our system of government. He doesn't get to say what is and isn't settled. That's something that's typically left to the American people to decide. And, if you believe the polls, they don't agree with him on that.
Absolutely. Dan, John frequently goes to heritageaction.com, and he's been following some of the stories up there, and he's got a couple questions for you and some stuff there if you can. Go ahead, John.
Hey, Dan. Well, first I have a quick comment here, which is to say, Dan, wasn't the Second Amendment settled? That doesn't seem to bother them from trying to change it on a daily basis.
Well, I mean, it's a matter of convenience, right? I mean, whatever they like is settled. Whatever they want to change is a mistake the founders made, and onward we will go.
So, Dan, we've had discussions with you over the past years about the Index of Economic Freedom. So I was reviewing the 2014 Index of Economic Freedom recently, and Dan, is it my imagination, or is the United States still not? We ought to be number 1 or 2, and we're not even in the top 10. And Dan, it seems like we're actually slipping in that index again. Can you explain briefly what the Index of Economic Freedom means, and why is America going in the wrong direction?
Yeah, I mean, it really is sort of a phenomenal concept when you think about the role that America has played in ushering in sort of a global free market and sort of this real capitalistic type nature that is arguably built the most prosperous nation in the history of the world. And what Heritage does is they take a whole bunch of these criteria that are really important to economic growth, measure where each country stands, and then assign sort of a ranking. And what we've seen consistently over the past several years, and it's worth noting, it started under the Bush administration, like a lot of our problems have, for different reasons than the left will say, but nonetheless, there's a theme there. The U.S. has been slipping. We're becoming less and less free, and not coincidentally, we've seen less and less economic growth. And you think about all the regulations, especially what happened under Bush, all the additional regulations that we've seen under Obama, including the healthcare law, including the financial reform overhaul, and sort of all these smaller bills that he passes to appease various constituency groups. That has a huge drag on the economy. And, the impact is taking away economic freedom from you and me, your listeners, and everybody else.
Now, doesn't the IRS scandal and the ongoing effort to cover that scandal up or shove it under the rug so that we can come back 18 months after the fact and yell, what difference does it make? But doesn't that really play into this economic freedom index as well?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that they look at in there is sort of the cronyism and corruption angle, right? And you can't look at the IRS scandal without thinking, what type of third world government operation is this? Or, I mean, this is more suited for Russia, maybe, intimidating Putin's political opponents than it is the U.S. And you're right, it does play into there, because when you have that sort of culture embedded in a country, whether it's sort of at the IRS overseeing political groups, it doesn't stop there, though. It's sort of systematic across the board, and that has dramatic implications for the way the country conducts itself, especially in the economy.
It's interesting that you bring up Russia in that context, because it's one of the things that I have always felt was there was a lot of mistakes made in how we handled, starting in particular with Clinton, how we handled Russia. But to at least the defense of the American business after the fall of the Soviet Union, you had all these enormous levels of cronyism and corruption, coupled with literally with fear. I mean, guys showing up with guns to threaten you if you didn't pay, kind of like Sicily, the turn of a whole century ago. So there's a little bit of understanding there, but it seems like we're starting to look a lot like that country that we used to compete against, and that country is starting to look more and more like a leader. And I bring that up in the context of not just economics, but remember, economic stability is ultimately the backbone of military stability, and all this ties to health, because if you're not a strong nation, you're not going to be a healthy nation, and you're not going to be able to afford health care. And if you invite your enemies to go after you, you're going to need potentially whole different levels of health care.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good point. There was an amazing write-up in the Wall Street Journal this morning, sort of going back through the administration's approach to Russia and how wrong it was. I mean, you had sort of the typical State Department bureaucrats trying to cover their tracks and say, "Oh yeah, we knew all along that Russia was changing, even though our outward approach didn't seem like we recognized it." But it is a fascinating sort of look into how the administration operates. It doesn't matter whether it's their domestic policy or their foreign policy. You get a real glimpse of it. These guys, even still through today, really don't have a good grasp on how things actually work. They have no doubt. There's no doubt that they're trying to accomplish things, right? They're determined to fundamentally change the nature of America's society and the role that government plays in our lives. And arguably they're doing a pretty good job at that. But they still don't understand how things actually work. And you can see that certainly with how wrong they were on Russia, let alone their prescription for economic growth.
Well, one of the reasons why we've been supporters of, and why we frequently bring on guests from Heritage Foundation as well as Heritage Action, is precisely because when you study over time, forget the BS rhetoric, when you actually study over time the documents that you guys have put out, what you believe will happen, the what-ifs, you're pretty accurate on a fairly regular basis. And so I have a question for you, because I think we also have to not just look at what the other parties are doing wrong, but we have to look at what we're doing wrong in in the right side of the aisle. And it seems like we may be overplaying the Obamacare instead of letting it try to die its own natural death, and get ahead of the game on what is already in the makings, the replay of the war on women, the war against Hispanics, the war against the retired, against the youth, etc. And I'll just use it as an example. You guys had a really good article a week before Tax Day about how tax reform could improve the system and some suggestions for common sense tax reform. I heard so little. I mean, what a perfect time for the Republicans or even conservative Democrats to be able to make the promotion for why tax reform is so critical, not just from an economic perspective, but from a freedom and liberty perspective.
Yeah, I mean, again, we still have this inability on the right side of the aisle to explain what we're talking about, right? And you can pop up a spreadsheet and we can walk you through the numbers and do it in a way that's as compelling as you can make a spreadsheet. But most people don't care, right? Worried about getting their kids to soccer practice, what's for dinner, making sure that homework is done before everybody goes to bed at night. And there's got to be a way, and there is certainly a way, and some folks are doing a good job of this, but going out and explaining how these policies actually impact folks. And that's one of the things that's so frustrating about the immigration debate, is that you have people like Karl Rove who go out and say, well, look, the way we appeal to Hispanic voters is by passing amnesty. That's not going to get you anywhere. Historically, that hasn't been the case. And just think about it, right? People aren't going to vote for you unless you're explaining to them why your policy solutions make their lives better. And we firmly believe that our policy positions do that, right? School choice is a great example of it. But on every other issue, our side has a really difficult time explaining to any community why these policies are better than the other side's.
No, I think you've got a very fair point there, Dan, and I think it's one of our biggest complaints also. But, it's something that, you guys do a good job of putting out, good information, tracking what everybody's doing, and just rating how people are voting in Congress, for example. And, here in the radio program, we're constantly going off about, guys like Karl Rove and where they stand on some of these issues. So anyway, Dan, I want to thank you so much for taking the time today. Again, I hope you had a great couple holidays, and we look forward to having you back in the program. And if you can, just share the website one more time for our listeners.
Yeah, thanks a lot, guys. It's heritageaction.com.
Okay, excellent. Well, you have a great afternoon, and we'll speak to you soon.
All right, sounds good.
All right, take it easy. Well, folks, that was Dan Holler. Again, he's the Communications Director with Heritage Action for America, and that's a sister group of the Heritage Foundation.